October 1944. A quiet town near Nancy, France. Sunlight filters through the trees outside a stone villa, casting long shadows across a damp courtyard. American intelligence officers walk into an abandoned Gestapo headquarters, their boots clicking against the tile floors. They descend a narrow flight of concrete stairs into the basement. The air down here smells of vinegar, old grease, and stale water. In the center of the room sits a heavy wooden table equipped with thick leather straps for the wrists and ankles. Next to it stands a metal bucket, a rough linen cloth, and a gray rubber hose connected directly to the building's main water pipe. A single clipboard hangs from a rusty nail on the wall, holding neat sheets of paper. General George S. Patton will soon read these pages and deliver a swift, mirrored justice that the men who occupied this basement will never forget. This is the story of what General Patton found in a Gestapo basement with a table, leather straps, and interrogation logs for 43 names. It is a story about the hidden costs of war and the heavy burden of discovering the true nature of an enemy. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what soldiers found that changed them forever. First Lieutenant Rachel Goldstein was 27 years old, born and raised in the crowded neighborhoods of New York City, and served as an intelligence officer in the United States Third Army. She grew up in a home filled with the sounds of traditional European languages, which drove her to master German at a young age. When the war began, she left her aging parents behind to enlist, determined to put her skills to use on the front lines of the intelligence struggle. Over the preceding months, she had seen the physical destruction of cities and the exhaustion of regular combat, but she had never encountered the hidden machinery of systemic cruelty. Her sharp mind and fluent understanding of the enemy's language brought her straight to the iron door of the basement near Nancy, where she became the first American to decode the clinical records of the horrors committed inside. Gestapo Criminal Inspector Hans Voss was 35 years old, born in Cologne, and operated as the chief interrogation specialist for the district. He believed entirely in the absolute supremacy of the state and viewed his work not as a moral failing, but as a scientific necessity for total victory. He often remarked to his subordinates that raw physical violence was wasteful and that true control was achieved through calculated, unyielding pressure. Voss enjoyed the unearned privileges of his rank, wearing a flawlessly tailored gray uniform, keeping his boots polished to a mirror shine, and using a silver pocket watch inherited from his aristocratic grandfather to time his sessions. He maintained a perfectly organized desk upstairs, complete with fine crystal glassware and expensive tobacco, entirely separated from the damp floor below, where he spent his afternoons. This meticulous routine defined his existence until the day the American advance forced him to abandon his facility and leave his neat records behind for the arriving troops. By October 1944, the German military infrastructure across northeast France was splintering under rapid pressure from the Allied advance. The United States Third Army pushed forward with intense speed, forcing the occupation forces to abandon long-held strongholds, administrative hubs, and regional police facilities. In this atmosphere of sudden retreat, the standard operating procedures of the German security apparatus began to break down into pure panic. Units left behind massive amounts of paperwork, equipment, and unvandalized installations that they normally would have incinerated or blown up to conceal their actions. The rapid withdrawal meant that secret field offices, local command posts, and urban interrogation centers fell into American hands completely intact, providing an unvarnished window into the daily realities of the occupation. In many sectors, frontline commanders hurried past these abandoned municipal buildings, focusing entirely on maintaining tactical momentum, securing intersections, and capturing retreating infantry units. Many officers viewed local police structures and security facilities as secondary concerns, often letting them sit unguarded or allowing frontline troops to clear them out for temporary billeting without preserving the contents. This casual approach often resulted in the loss of vital administrative records, intelligence files, and physical evidence that could connect specific individuals to regional security operations. The focus remained entirely on the map, the next ridge line, and the speed of the armored columns moving toward the German border. But near Nancy, the discovery of the hidden basement room stopped the forward momentum of the local intelligence detachment, turning a routine building clearance into a detailed investigation of specialized brutality. Lieutenant Goldstein stood at the bottom of the concrete stairs, staring at the wet floor and holding the clipboard that detailed exactly what had occurred in that small space over the preceding months. Lieutenant Goldstein stood at the top of the cellar stairs, her fingers gripping the metal railing as she looked down at the heavy oak door. She turned to Captain Thomas Miller, a 32-year-old company commander from Chicago, serving in the 318th Infantry Regiment, who stood right behind her with a lit flashlight. "We need to clear this basement," Miller said. "The door is unlocked," Goldstein answered. Miller pushed past her, his boots thudding against the damp wooden steps, until he reached the bottom and kicked the door wide open. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, stagnant air, reflecting off the wet concrete floor and illuminating the heavy table in the center of the room. He walked slowly toward the structure, tracing his fingers along the thick leather straps bolted to the frame before shining his light on the gray rubber hose connected to the copper plumbing. "This looks like a standard utility workshop," Miller said. "Look at the straps." "Captain," Goldstein answered. "It is just an ordinary maintenance cellar for the building," Miller said. Goldstein stepped into the room, walked directly to the wooden wall, and lifted the aluminum clipboard from its iron hook. She flipped through the damp pages, her eyes scanning the neat columns of names, dates, and repetitive German notations written in dark ink. "It is an interrogation facility," Goldstein said. "These are just administrative police records," Miller said. "The logs list 43 separate subjects over the last 8 months." Goldstein answered. "The local forces were simply processing civilian detainees." Miller said. "They used water torture on every person listed here," Goldstein said. Miller took the clipboard from her hands, squinting at the precise German handwriting that detailed the exact duration and water temperature for each session. He pointed to a repeated phrase stamped next to 36 of the names on the list. "What does this specific entry mean?" Miller asked. "It says enhanced interrogation," Goldstein answered. "That could mean any standard military questioning method," Miller said. "It means they strapped people down and flooded their lungs," Goldstein said. "We do not have the authorization to halt our advance for local police matters," Miller said. 7 people died on this table," Goldstein answered. Miller dropped the clipboard onto the wooden table, the heavy aluminum backing making a sharp clattering sound against the thick leather straps. He walked toward the exit, shaking his head as he looked back at the damp concrete floor and the iron drain. "The regiment moves out in 30 minutes," Miller said. "We cannot leave this evidence behind," Goldstein answered. "This is a matter for the local authorities after we secure the sector," Miller said. "It is a war crime, Captain," Goldstein said. Miller stopped at the base of the stairs, pulled his radio receiver from his belt, and signaled the division headquarters to request an immediate staff review. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The vehicle stopped with a sharp jerk on the gravel outside the villa, and the general walked in unannounced. He didn't say a word as he stepped through the front doors, his polished leather boots striking the floorboards with a rhythmic, heavy snap. The officers in the hallway froze instantly, snapping to rigid salutes as the general passed them without a sideways glance. He moved straight toward the basement stairs, his dark eyes fixed on the entrance to the cellar. He went down the steps into the damp air, his presence changing the entire temperature of the small room. Patton studied him. Voss stood against the concrete wall, his tailored uniform completely unwrinkled and his chin held high. "Is this your paperwork?" Patton asked. "It is the standard administrative record of my station," Voss said. "Did you sign these specific entries?" Patton asked. "I maintain the logs according to my direct operational directives," Voss said. "Did these 7 people die on this table?" Patton asked. They succumbed to standard physical complications during routine processing, Voss said. Patton said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the wet floor. You sit up upstairs in a clean room with fine tobacco while you record the destruction of human beings down here like a clerk counting sacks of grain. You write down the thickness of the cloth and the temperature of the water with the precision of a physician. But you are nothing more than a common murderer with a fountain pen. You believe your tailored uniform and your aristocratic grandfather's watch separate you from the blood on this floor. They do not. Lieutenant Goldstein left her home in New York to preserve the evidence of what you attempted to hide in the dark. She translates your clinical euphemisms in real time, and she recognizes exactly what you are. Every name she reads from your neat logbooks strips away the illusion of your military standing. You did not conduct military intelligence operations. You ran a torture chamber with paperwork. You have a choice. You will lie on this wooden table, your wrists and ankles bound by the very straps you complained were too weak, and you will experience the exact methodology you documented so carefully. Or you will sign a full confession detailing every name, every date, and every casualty inflicted in this cellar. Decide now. Voss looked at the heavy leather straps on the table, then at the gray hose, and finally at the cold eyes of the general. His arrogance collapsed into a silent, trembling nod as he reached for the pen. The signed confession was hammered onto the wooden tabletop with a heavy brass dagger. Lieutenant Goldstein stood by the door, holding her camera steady as the flash illuminated the dark room, capturing the clinical rows of names, the rusted iron drain, and the shaking hands of the chief interrogator. Two military policemen stepped forward, their heavy web belts creaking in the silence as they grabbed Voss by his gray wool sleeves and hauled him away from the desk. They dragged him up the concrete stairs, his boots scraping against the stone steps where 43 prisoners had walked before him. Outside in the courtyard, the local French townspeople stood in silence, watching the clean uniform of the specialist disappear into the back of an American truck. The heavy iron door of the villa was slammed shut and sealed with official military tape, locking away the bucket, the hose, and the restraints as evidence for the tribunals. Patton climbed into his jeep, his eyes fixed forward on the road toward Germany as the engine roared to life. The armored columns of the Third Army began to move out immediately, rolling past the villa and leaving the secured basement behind as a permanent record of what had been discovered. Rachel Goldstein returned to New York City after the demobilization of the Third Army, carrying the memories of the basement with her for the rest of her days. She married a local clerk in 1948, raised 3 children in a quiet neighborhood in Queens, and spent 30 years working as a high school history teacher. She rarely spoke to her family about the villa near Nancy, but she kept a small, black and white photograph of the basement table locked inside a cedar chest in her bedroom. She died quietly in her sleep in 1994, surrounded by her grandchildren, leaving behind the translated logs as her permanent contribution to the documentation of the war. Hans Voss was transferred to an Allied detention facility before being handed over to a military tribunal for regional war crimes during the subsequent trials. His signed confession formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, preventing any attempt to claim his duties were merely administrative or routine. He was convicted of unlawful executions and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in a guarded federal penitentiary. He was released early in 1961 due to failing health, returning to a quiet, bitter retirement in Cologne, where he lived alone until his death in 1974. General Patton never recorded the details of the basement facility in his official public logs, choosing instead to file the entire dossier under confidential intelligence records. He mentioned the villa only once in a brief, private letter written to his wife just 3 days after the discovery. He wrote that the true horror of the enemy was not found in the fury of their counterattacks, but in the cold, quiet precision of their filing cabinets. Some historians have argued that Patton's aggressive intervention in regional security matters strayed too far from his primary tactical responsibilities, distracting his command staff from frontline operations during a critical phase of the European campaign. These critics suggest that local occupation infractions and regional police actions should have been left entirely to secondary civil affairs units or municipal courts after the sector was fully stabilized. Others have argued the opposite, defending the general's swift action as a necessary measure to preserve crucial documentation and establish an immediate standard of accountability before evidence could be destroyed. What is certain is that the detailed confession secured in that basement near Nancy provided an unbroken chain of physical evidence that war crimes prosecutors utilized to achieve definitive convictions during the subsequent military tribunals. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the investigation entirely to the local French authorities? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what soldiers found that changed them forever, make sure to subscribe.